Well, good morning. I'm so glad to see all of you guys here today. Um, we are going to be going over some discussion today of the Industrial Revolution, and I'm very happy and glad to be able to be a part with you guys here in discussing the Industrial Revolution. Hopefully, you have a document in front of you that's called The Industrial Revolution Begins. We're going to be discussing in our time together this morning. The Industrial Revolution begins. And one of the things about the Industrial Revolution is there's a great quotation on the very top of your handout that I think kind of highlights like the big changes that are being made at this time. And the handout, it says, there's a quote, it says, "One man draws out the wire, another straightens it, the third cuts it, and a fourth points it. And the important business of making a pin is, in this manner, divided into about 18 distinct operations." This is from a book by Adam Smith. He wrote a book called Wealth of Nations in 1776. And that's like a really big deal because what Adam Smith is describing is that to make a single pin, like, something to use with sewing and working with cloth, that instead of like one person making it, you have 18 different people involved in the operation of making a pin. And that may seem like, well, that seems like a waste. That seems like that doesn't make any sense. But what Adam Smith is explaining is this process is actually going to make it cheaper than anything else that has ever happened before in the Industrial Revolution. We'll get back to this theme a little bit later. But what we're going to be talking about now is this transformation from like a process where it would be like one guy making a pin to 18 different people making it. And by doing that process, we're going to see that production of things becomes cheaper, and actually production of things becomes quicker as well. On the first line of our handout, it tells us that in the late 17th and 18th century, that this was it was not just new political ideas changing the world. We talked about how Enlightenment changed the world. We talked about the American, the French, the Haitian, the Creole revolutions. Those were all changing the world. But at the same time, we also see something else changing the world. We see technology reshaping society. In fact, on that first handout, it says at this time period that technology transformed society. It is called the Industrial Revolution. It's called the Industrial Revolution. So not only do we have political revolutions, where we have the Americans and the French saying that kings don't just get to rule because they've always ruled. That was called divine right of kings, where they thought kings had the right to rule because God put them in charge. But now we also see the role that technology is playing to totally transform society. So this is called the Industrial Revolution, and this marks a period of how industrialization, will write down, changed society. That making things forever and ever and ever, people made things by hand. It was just like things were made as quickly as you could produce them by hand, but no more. Now we're going to see industrialization, a time period of how industrialization changed society. And industrialization is the mechanization of production. That's what industrialization is. It's the mechanization of production. Production is going to go from a single person making stuff by hand to a machine making something. So think about the difference of cost. If, for example, you're going to go to prom, or you're going to go to a dance, you're going to go to some big event, and you had a dress that was going to be made custom made. It's your dress is the only dress of this kind that exists in the entire world. You can imagine the cost of that dress. It's going to be astronomical. It's going to be super high. But if instead of a custom made dress, you go to Macy's and you get like a map, there's just one of many of these dresses. There's a whole bunch of these dresses. The cost is going to be relatively low because it was a dress that was mass produced. And so we're going to see this. Industrialization is the mechanization of production. You're producing stuff not by hand, but you're producing stuff instead by machine. It says on your handout that doing by machine what could not be done as quickly, as cheaply by hand. We were now going to be doing by machine what could not be done as quickly or as cheaply by hand. Well, now let's kind of talk about just general, like, where does this industrial revolution actually begin? I mean, we talked about the physical places that the American Revolution began. We talked about the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution. We talked about South American revolutions with the Creole-led revolutions. But what about the Industrial Revolution? Where does it start? Where does it begin? And the answer to that question is it's going to start in Great Britain. Great Britain's the first place it's going to start, but it's not going to just stay in Great Britain. Technology has a way of spreading. And that is what we see with the Industrial Revolution as well. In fact, its first wave would then move throughout Europe and North America. So it starts in Great Britain, and then it's going to go to Europe. It's going to go to North America. These are the places they're going to be leading the world in the Industrial Revolution. It says subsequent waves. In subsequent waves, it would then move throughout the rest of the world. So it's not just the West. It's not just the United States or Britain or France or Germany. The entire world is going to experience the Industrial Revolution, but it's going to experience it in different ways and in different phases. So that is the subsequent waves. It would move throughout the rest of the world. Below that, there's a couple things that the Industrial Revolution is going to lead to. And one thing it's going to lead to is a general pattern of increasing world population. In fact, we're going to see that at this time, population is going to skyrocket during the Industrial Revolution. We're going to see at this time in the Industrial Revolution the growth of cities at a level that we've not seen before. We're going to see cities get bigger. We're going to see population centers explode. This is a general pattern we call urbanization. We're also going to see a shifting of people from the farm to the city. We're going to see a shifting population where people were living in farms, and that's where like most people found their home. And now we're going to see in the Industrial Revolution people living overwhelmingly in urban centers, a move from farm to city, and also the expanding production and consumption of goods. We're also going to see the expanding production and consumption of goods. So not only are factories producing more stuff, but people are also going to be consuming more stuff as well. We're going to see a big change because, all around the world, people before the Industrial Revolution are they're working for and living on the equivalent of like $2 a day. All throughout the world, before the Industrial Revolution, people are living on and making the equivalent of $2 a day. And think about how quickly, what can you actually own if you're making $2 a day? Well, not a whole lot of stuff. People are going to live very simple lives. They're going to have very basic possessions. But the more wealth that gets produced, the more that we demand, the more that we can consume, the more that we can want. And so this is going to be a huge change in the Industrial Revolution. Okay, the next section we're going to now talk about is some agricultural improvements. It says in the early 1700s, the world had already experienced something that we've talked about called an agricultural revolution. So the world had already experienced an agricultural revolution. So what do I mean by that? Well, couple of things that we've talked about is that there's these new crops that were at first only found in the New World. The New World is what we call North America and South America. It was called the New World because it was new to the Europeans. The Europeans didn't know that North America and South America were a thing. You might remember that Chris Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. And Chris Columbus's goal, his desire, was to get to Asia. He was hoping to get to China, hoping to get to, a place near India. And when he landed in the Americas, he didn't know where he was. So he called the brown-skinned Native American people he met Indians, thinking he was in Asia, and he probably died confused. Now, we don't celebrate Chris Columbus necessarily for the fact that he was confused and died thinking he was in Asia. But Chris Columbus did something really important. He started connecting two different worlds that had been separated for thousands of years. The old landed. When Chris Columbus landed in the Americas, he brought those two worlds together. And that bringing of worlds together we call the Columbian Exchange. That's what we're going to write down on the handout. It says that corn and potatoes, that they were introduced to the old world due to the Columbian Exchange. And that was the start of what we call the agricultural revolution, that there was foods that were cheap. There were foods that were easy to, like The Martian. We've talked about this before. This is a Matt Damon movie where he's stuck in space on Mars. What is something that is pretty hardy, pretty easy to grow, pretty tough? Well, it's the potato, and it's packed with calories, and this is going to help increase world population. It says on the second line, this increase for the average person, even for the poor, write down calorie consumption. So you have really cheap products. You have things like corn. You have things like potatoes. These are easy to grow. These are accessible to poor people, and it's going to change people's lives in Africa, in Europe, in Asia. This increased calorie consumption for Europeans. So below this, what does this do? What does the introduction of corn and potatoes to the old world do? What does this increase of calories do? Well, this increase of calories leads to an increase in global population. It leads to an increase in global population. And the thing is that that's such a huge thing because for many places, in many ways, in many years, people were struggling sometimes to have enough food to make sure that they could survive. And that's something that's going to change in this agricultural revolution. We're going to see an increase in global population. And such growth is going to actually be even greater than the earlier deaths that were caused by smallpox. You might remember that in that Columbian Exchange, not only were, the Columbian Exchange's move of people and animals and plants and diseases. And one of the things about the Columbian Exchange is that the Columbian Exchange results in the death of, in some places, 80 to 90% of Native American populations. That's terrible, right? As terrible as smallpox, which was one of the many diseases at the time to do its damage, was, the population increase that happens because of things like corn and potatoes, it outdoes the deaths of pandemic, the deaths of things like smallpox. And so there was a trade-off. There is a balance that happens with all the millions of people that die from smallpox, of pandemic in the New World. Millions more will survive and be born because of the agricultural revolution. It says on the handout that increased technology also increased, we'll write down, crop yields. Crop yields, a yield, Y-I-E-L-D, a crop yield. In other words, that they were able to yield more. They were able to grow more crops as a result of the technology that they were producing. So we see an increase in crop yield. More was being produced. Also, we see that improved medical care meant that infant mortality rates declined, that kids were actually living past those early months or even those early years when children would tend to die from, lack of good quality food. We see that infant mortality declined. And with infant mortality declining, we see that more people were able to survive into adulthood because we had a lot of instances where people are being born but they just weren't surviving in those first few weeks, those first few months. But now we see more people surviving into an adulthood. And now that means with so many more people alive, we need less of these adults. Less of these adults are needed to farm. I mean, we don't need everyone farming. And that means that there's going to be an opportunity for all this new generation of adults to do something other than farm. And so these adults are now going to be free to work in urban factories. They're going to be a great source of work in order to fill these jobs in urban factories. These adults are free now to work in urban factories. So let's talk a little bit about now transitioning to what life was like in pre-industrial societies. So on our handout, in the section that's called pre-industrial societies, during the 18th centuries, most British people lived in rural areas. Most grew their own food and most made their own clothes. That's just like that's what society was like. You live out in the farm, you grow your own food, you make your own clothes. And this is actually like how a lot of people all around the world live to this day. They live in villages, they live in the countryside, they grow their own food, and they make their own clothes. And much, it says on your handout, of the clothes they made were from local wool. And so, what did they have in Britain? What did they have in Europe? They had a lot of sheep. Sheep were being grown, they were being raised, and so clothes was made out of wool. And cotton used to be a luxury good. It used to be something that Europeans did not have easy access to. It was not something that Europeans could get cheaply, but all that began to change. In fact, it says on the handout that due to maritime or sea-based empires, there was an increased importation of popular Indian cotton. So now that Europeans are sailing around the world, now that Europeans are going to places like India, they're seeing and they're getting access to cotton, which is like what all of our shirts are made of today. And if you had a choice between a shirt made out of wool or a shirt made out of cotton, I think it's pretty clear what you're going to choose. Europeans want that. And the British, it says, wanted to grow their own cotton and not be dependent on Indian imports. They did not want to be dependent on Indian imports because the British don't want to enrich the Indians. The British don't want to be giving their money to India. The British think, well, yes, I want cotton, but what would be better than giving money to India and making them wealthier? What if we grow it ourselves? What if we do that instead? And that is what they want to do. It says on the handout that the British began growing cotton from colonies in the Americas using, guess what? Slave labor. They use slave labor. We've talked about slavery a lot, and we've typically talked about slavery in the context of sugar. But something that you're probably familiar with is that we also have in our country, especially, slaves used in the production of cotton. And so the British began growing cotton from the colonies in the America using slave labor. And merchants, it says, would bring this cotton from these slave plantations, from the colonies. They would bring cotton to Britain, allowing women to work in their own homes to spin it into finished cloth. And so, growing it is going to be done in the Americas. They're going to harvest it in the Americas, but then they're going to send it to England. And now that it's in England, women are going to work in their own homes, and they're going to be doing this, spinning it into finished cloth at home. Now, that's women working from home, and that's great, but that is not very efficient. That is not going to be able to mass produce the kind of numbers that we need in order to meet demand. And so merchants start this as their first strategy, and they're going to change it. It says, this working of raw cotton into finished fabric in the home of poor working class women is known as a cottage industry. So a cottage, that word cottage, it is a reference to where people live, right? A cottage, like if you use that word, a cottage is like a house. And so when we use this vocabulary term, a cottage industry, we're saying that this is an industry done at home. And that's cool. That's great. That provides jobs for women. But a cottage industry is not going to be able to mass produce the kind of things that we see right now in the pandemic with COVID-19, with this virus going throughout the United States. There's a shortage of ventilators, and there's shortages of masks. And what some people are doing is they're like sewing their own, and you can like volunteer, and you can get online and find kits how to make masks, or these masks to prevent the spread. Well, that's great, and that's going to help, but it's not going to help as much as mass production is. Ford Motor Company, for example, is used to making cars, thousands of cars every single week. And now Ford Motor Company has announced that they're going to be now not making cars, but Ford is going to be making ventilators. And they expect to make like 100,000 ventilators in the next, 9 to 12 weeks. And so that's a lot. And that's an example of mass production. Now, the British appreciate these hardworking women making stuff at home in these cottage industries, but it's not going to be enough. It says on the handout, cottage industries prove to be slow, and merchants look to produce cloth quicker and cheaper. And so we're going to see cottage industries be a start, but we're going to see factories are going to be the end goal. And we'll kind of see how and why that factories are quicker and cheaper. So let's talk now about the growth of technology, and why is it that the Industrial Revolution starts in Britain? Well, there's a couple things about Great Britain that is going to be a reason why we'll see the Industrial Revolution start there. There's going to be a reason we'll see the Industrial Revolution start in Great Britain. One has to do with geography. The geography of Britain is that, what is Great Britain? Great Britain, it's an island, right? Great Britain is an island, and it is naturally just filled with great ports. There's wonderful natural ports all around this island nation of Britain, and that's going to be good because by having these great ports, it's going to help them with international trade. So that's the first thing. But then there's a second thing that we also see. We also see that Britain has also just a ton of mineral resources. In fact, it turns out, it says on your handout that Britain has vast deposits of coal. Now, coal is super important because when we think about the Industrial Revolution, there's a lot of different things that you need coal for. But the number one thing that you need coal for is that it says it would be needed to fuel the steam engine. So the steam engine is like the great game changer that we're going to see at this time. The steam engine is going to be what's going to be driving these machines to do things that no hand could do easily. So the steam engine. And the steam engine, it says on our handout, would also help in the production uh, of iron, the production of iron. Iron is going to be a metal that has been used in the past, but it has been super expensive in the past. But now that I can use the steam engine, I can make the process of making iron faster. I can have that process of making iron cheaper. And if it's faster and cheaper, it's going to create all kinds of possibilities for me to make stuff I could never make before. For example, coal, these steam engines, this burning of coal would allow for me to get these high temperatures needed to separate from impurities. It already says that on your handout. And the fact that I can, you heat it up in these and like, for example, in a crucible, you get the iron ore and the temperature is heated up, and the temperature causes all the impurities. It's so hot, the impurities rise to the top. You can remove those impurities, and what you have left is something stronger than you would have had before. And that's great, because I'm going to start making stuff that I could never make before, and I need it as strong as possible. It says on your handout that coal would also help in the production of steel. And steel is yet stronger than iron. And so what am I going to be able to do with steel? Well, there's going to be things that I'm going to make that I could not have made otherwise. For example, steel is going to allow the construction of three things. We're going to be able to do taller buildings as a result of steel being used, taller buildings as a result of steel being used. I'm going to be able to have longer bridges. In fact, if you go to New York City, Brooklyn Bridge is a great example of what I can do with steel. I'm going to be able to have something that's stronger, something that can make these longer bridges. And also, number three, I can even have stronger ships that can carry more cargo. And that's another huge thing, because you know what? Ship sizes, we'll talk about this in a future lecture, ship sizes are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And that means more trade. And that means more money. And that means wealth is going to be generated to higher degrees than we've ever seen before. So three things: taller buildings, longer bridges, and stronger ships to carry more cargo. So what kind of relationship do the colonies of Britain have with industrialization? And there's going to be a lot. In fact, it says that these slave-based colonies in the Americas provided Britain with things like raw materials. And we've talked about this before. We've talked about how there's an idea that the colonies existed for one reason, and that was to provide raw materials to the British. And that philosophy we've talked about in the past was called mercantilism. Well, we see that in this idea that these colonies, they only exist for the purpose of providing raw materials, things like timber, things like cotton, things like sugar or coffee. And these slave-based colonies in the Americas would create vast amounts of wealth. The reason why we grow sugar, the reason why we grow cotton and coffee is there's so much money to be made from those things. And this wealth that the British are making from cotton, from sugar, from coffee is going to be reinvested into factories. And so the sad thing is that the British do start this industrial revolution. And the sad thing is that a lot of the money that made that industrial revolution happen was the result of African forced labor. And so there is a connection between African slavery and industrialization. It would have been a lot harder for the British to have factories, a lot harder for the British to industrialize if they had not enslaved millions of Africans and brought them by force to the Americas, unfortunately. Other things that helped the British to lead the Industrial Revolution. It says abundant rivers. This made this allowed for raw materials and finished goods to be moved cheaply. I can make these goods and now I can move these goods through these networks of rivers. They don't have freeways, they don't have trains early on yet, but these things, these rivers, these natural highways, there's a ton of them in Britain, and it's going to help move these goods along. We also see strong fleets. Britain had the strongest navy, allowing their ships around the world protection. And so the British are also famous because they got a really good navy. And it's great for me to be moving products all around the world, but it does me no good if I move those products and I potentially am going to lose those products. The great thing about the British is they have one of the strongest navies in the world. They can protect their goods. We also see something that's kind of funny. Maybe it doesn't really make sense when you look at it. It says the protection of private property. I was watching a musical recently, Fiddler on the Roof. Maybe you've seen this musical. If you have Amazon Prime, I think it's on Amazon Prime. It's 3 hours, but it's worth watching. LaPorte High School's done it before. I hope they do it again. But I don't think this really ruins anything if you've never seen it. But at the end of Fiddler on the Roof, the Russian government basically decides that they're going to kick out the Jews from their property. And they say, hey, sorry, just to let you know, you have to move. You have to leave. This farm that has been yours forever is not your farm anymore. You have to go. And though this is terrible and unjust, this stuff happens all the time, all around the world. Governments routinely kick people out. They take over companies. They steal ideas. There is not in every country this idea of protection of private property. In our country, the United States, we have incredibly strong protections. Your home is not a place that the government can just knock on the door and say, sorry, you got a day to get out. You have 3 days to get out. We're taking it over. That's not something that can easily happen in the United States. We have property rights. You have land that you own. And the fact that we have that, and we assume that that's normal and natural, it's not normal and natural all around the world. It says on your handout that Britain had a legal tradition that recognized and protected the right to private property. The right to private property. This is not something everyone in the world has, but the fact that the British have it, they give it to us. We were 13 British colonies, so we inherit this idea. But this allowed, it says on your handout, assurances to entrepreneurs. That word entrepreneur, it means a business person, someone who's starting a business. This allowed entrepreneurs, assurance to entrepreneurs that their business would not be taken over by the government. If I know that my business is not going to be taken over by the government, then I have no problem investing into no problem pouring into my business, because I know that the government's not just going to knock on my door and take all of my profits away. They're not just going to take over my property. So I feel pretty good about my business. So I feel pretty good about investing and putting time and energy and money into it. I know the government's not going to take my business away. Because of this, it says entrepreneurs were willing to take risks, because the only way that you make money is by taking risks. And I know that I'm willing to take a risk knowing that the government was providing for businesses some protection and some independence. Protection and independence. That the government was not going to allow some random person to take over my business. The government wasn't going to take over my business itself either. They provided protection and independence. I'm willing to take risks. If I'm willing to take risks, we're going to see the increased ability for entrepreneurs to make money. All of this that we're talking about is actually what we see with capitalism. We see all of this with capitalism. So what else do we see? Well, we also see, and it says on your handout, growing population and urbanization. Poor people used to be able to farm on government-owned property called the Commons. At LaPorte High School, we have a front area of our high school that people spend time in or hang out in the morning. And that part of the school is called the Commons. It's not no one's classroom. It's not a lecture hall. It's just this open area that people can spend time in. And in England, it used to be that a lot of people didn't own land, but the government allowed people to farm in this area called the Commons. Okay, that's great, and that's how it used to be, but the government changed this, and they only allowed access to that land for people who paid for it. So if you do not pay for access to the farmland, the British government wasn't going to let you to farm there anymore. And that means that if I'm a poor regular person, I need to find a solution to put on the table. I need to find a different line of work than farming because I don't have access to that anymore. There's a name for this. It's black bold lettered vocabulary word. It's called the Enclosure Movement. They're closing the land. They're closing the land from access from everyone to only certain people who can afford it. This Enclosure Movement, access to farming land for the poor, leading many to move to cities for work. So now people are going to, they have to provide for themselves. They have to find work. And so they're going to be moving to cities for work. This is called the Enclosure Movement. And industrial, like Manchester, industrial cities like Liverpool began to grow in population and industry. We have all these people that are looking for work, all these people that need jobs, all these people that are not able to farm anymore. And they're going to be going to places like Manchester and Liverpool that are going to grow in population and industry. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how technology is now playing a role. And so we do see mass production of things. We're making things in these factories at in levels we've never seen before. One area of mass production is pottery. And that's kind of a funny thing to think about, but we'll kind of talk about why that's a thing. We do see mass production. We see repetitive tasks, and there's an arrow. Repetitive tasks that are faster, things that are cheaper. For example, me forging it to the whole process from beginning to end would be me. I would be an artisan. I would be someone who had skills. I would have a lot of knowledge. And that's great and all, but that's like really expensive to hire someone who's going to design, who's going to make it, who's going to produce it, all those things. It's expensive to have an artisan. It would be a lot cheaper if I start mass producing it, where like think about cars. When you think about like maybe you studied in 8th grade, like mass production, like the assembly, and there would be like a car, and there would be one guy and his whole job is put on a tire. There'd be one guy, his whole job is to lower the engine into the car. You broke it down into very cheap steps so that I know all day long, all I'm doing is I'm putting a tire on. I know all day long is I'm doing the paint job all day long. And I'm really good at putting tires in. I'm really good at doing the paint job. I'm really good at lowering the engine in, but I don't know anything else about it. That is going to be what we are talking about when we see mass production. We're going to see repetitive tasks. And these repetitive tasks, simple repetitive tasks, breaking it down. In the beginning of our document, there was an explanation that how they made, like, you put a pin in it. A pin was made by 18 different people. And that's kind of like ridiculous that you'd have 18 people doing that. But that made it cheaper than it ever could have been before. Now, there was a problem, it says on your handout, with porcelain before the 18th century. And the problem with porcelain, the problem with fancy plates and cups, was that fancy plates and cups were from China. It says that they were from China and they were just really just too expensive. They were from China and they were just too expensive. And there's something that is really new to the British that and Europeans in general that's going to make them realize that they need better cups, more access to it. And one of the things it says that European desires for New drinks required better cups. For example, one of the things that Europeans are drinking a whole lot of is tea, and a lot of things Europeans are now drinking is coffee. Well, tea and coffee are things that are made, they're hot. And so I need good porcelain cups. I need good cups that are able to withstand boiling temperatures. These new drinks required certain cups. And there's going to be people, they're going to figure out ways to make that quicker and cheaper. There's a guy you should know by name, a guy named Josiah Wedgwood. And his most important contribution in all of this discussion is what we call the division of labor. This division of labor is what we were kind of talking about before. This division of labor is this splitting up of tasks into very, very simple steps, this division of labor. Workers, as a result, though, had fewer skills, and so they were paid less. You know, think about, again, the example of like Ford Motor Company. If my job all day is just to put tires on a car, if my job all day is just to lower a engine into the vehicle, well, I don't have a lot of skill. Compare that to if my job, you know, or like imagine making porcelain cups, you know, division of labor meant one guy, his whole job is, I'm going to take this and I'm going to put it into the oven. Some other guy's going to pull it out of the oven at the center of time. Another guy's going to do the paint. Another guy's going to, you know, put it into a box. You know, all I do all day is put a mug into a box. That's my job. That's what I do. I don't have a lot of skills. Before the Industrial Revolution, there would be one guy who would design the mug. He would form the mug. He would put it into an oven. He would paint it. All that was done by one guy. That one guy had an incredible skill set and got paid well. Now with division of labor, they have broken it up into various steps. Workers have fewer skills. They're paid less. But here's the positive. Cost of production, the cost of products produced was also less. The cost of production was also less. So not only am I paying workers less, but I'm also going to be getting the things that I'm producing are also less as well. Cost of products produced was less. This contribution of strict discipline and new machinery allowed lower costs, things like stackable cups, because if you have in your cupboard, like, you know, like say Dixie cups, solo cups, we call them, they can be stacked, right? Well, the only reason that's even a thing is because of the Industrial Revolution. Because if I'm having like one mold I'm using and I can make 10 cups that can be stacked up, that's because I'm mass producing these things. Stackable cups are also a result of the Industrial Revolution. One mold means that these cups are cheaper. So even things like solo cups are a result ultimately of the Industrial Revolution. Let's talk a little bit about cotton now. So cotton industry also sees industrialization and mechanization. It says we see machines are replacing the work done by hand. It used to be that people are making shirts and clothing by hand. What can you imagine is true of the cost of a shirt if my shirt is being designed and made by hand? It's going to be astronomically expensive. Well, this process is made cheaper and quicker by machines. So machines are going to help change this. And cotton had originally been a common cloth from two different countries, India and China. And so Europeans, when they come into contact with cotton cloth, they love it. They think it's great. But you know what's going to be true about these cotton prices? If it's coming from China and India, it's going to be super expensive. That's a problem. But another problem is that Europeans wanted to adopt cotton because it was cooler and it was softer than wool. I would rather have a shirt made out of cotton than a shirt made out of wool. And so we see that the Europeans have reasons to want to make the switch. And there's going to be some pieces of technology that help that switch happen. And some of these pieces of technology have funny names. And the first one on your handout is called the Jenny. And the Jenny is not a person, but it's a piece of technology. And it allows Europeans working with the Jenny to make up to 80 threads at once. 80 at once. I mean, can you imagine the difference in productivity when you are working and you're just like making one thread? Like you're not just making a shirt, you're just not making the cloth. You're a guy whose last name is Arkwright, and he made something called the water frame. And this is another tool, the water frame, and it made stronger thread. There is a third piece of technology. We talked about the Jenny, which allows you to make 80 thread at once, the water frame, which makes that thread stronger. But there's also the Mule. And this is not the animal, this is a piece of technology. And the Mule allows you to make thinner and still stronger thread. So these are all kind of just funny names for these pieces of technology. But look at the difference that these pieces of technology make. Look at the handout. It says that it used to take 500 hours to spin 1 pound. Just 1 pound, I'm making cloth, right? And imagine like you have an outfit or a shirt. It took 500 hours. A work week is 40 hours. So we're talking about weeks of work to make 1 pound of cloth. But look at the arrow. We now have that number go down. We're going to write down it was now 3 hours with the Mule. What used to take 500 hours of a woman working in her house, it went down with this piece of technology called the Mule to 3 hours. That's a huge, guess what's going to happen to the price? Guess what's going to happen to the cost of a shirt? If it used to take 500 hours to make 1 pound, and now it costs 3 hours. It takes 3 hours. If I'm paying someone by the hour, guess what's super affordable? Guess what becomes cheap? Guess what becomes something I can have more and more of? I can have more and more clothes. In the United States, think about your closet. There's likely shirts and skirts and outfits that you haven't worn in months or years filling your closet. And for us, one reason why that's true is we relatively have just a lot of expendable income that we can afford that. But in many countries, hand me down, and you are wearing a shirt, regardless if it's for a boy or for a girl, that's your shirt. And that's all you have. Just look at pictures of the developing world in Latin America, India, and Africa. You'll see a lot of that. But for the West, these prices go down, and it goes down even more. The last blank on that line is by 1830. It took only 80 minutes to make a pound of cotton. So think about these changes. It used to take 500 hours to make 1 pound. It goes down to 3 hours. And then by 1830, 80 minutes, an hour and 20 minutes to do the job. I used to have a job that took 500 hours. Now I can take care of that because of machine 20 minutes. What's going to happen to the price of cotton? Well, we're going to look that it dropped 90%. Can you imagine the cost of gasoline dropped 90%? Can you imagine the cost of your laptops or an iPhone or your internet bill dropped 90%? What a different world that would make. Now, there's another thing that we see as well. There's a guy that you probably know, a guy named Eli Whitney, and he invents something called the cotton gin. He made cotton more profitable in the U.S. with the cotton gin. That's Gin. The cotton gin is an important piece of technology because there's a problem with cotton is that it's filled with these seeds. And if you take out, you can't make anything out of it until you seeds. But removing the seeds is like the hardest thing that you've ever tried to do. It's super laborious, takes a long time. And the cotton gin, it mechanically removes these seeds, making it profitable to grow cotton in America. And so this piece of technology, it's amazing. It helps cotton to become cheaper, to be easier easier for it to be profitable. But the bummer is this piece of technology also increases, you know what? slavery in the United States, in particular on cotton plantations. So big changes in technology have unforeseen consequences, like the increase of slavery. America, by the 1850s, of the world's production of cotton, the United States made 5/6 of the world's cotton. That means for every 6 pounds, every 6 tons of cotton in the world, 5 out of 6 of it was made in the United States. And so this is something that's going to be driven by technology we develop, like the cotton gin. It's going to be something that's going to be driven by slave labor that we have in the American South. 5 out of 6 tons of it is to be made in the United States. That's good for us. That's incredible for us. But you know who that's not good for? Think India. Think about China. Think about these countries that used to make it by hand and make a lot of money selling it to Europeans. But now that job, that industry, that wealth and income that they had is no longer there anymore. Well, let's now talk about iron, and then we'll talk about the steam engine, and we'll actually bring our time to a close today, even though we have some other things to cover. We'll get to those tomorrow. Let's look at the iron industry. Iron was rare and it was valuable outside of China before the 18th century. And so China was a leader again in something that Europeans wanted. Just like we saw that China was a leader in cotton, Europeans wanted it, so they just made it on their own. We see that China was a leader in iron, Europeans wanted it, and they looked to make it on their own for cheaper. It says that there's something called coke, and coke is something that you burn. It has impurities. It's charcoal with the impurities removed. It says the role of coke to be burned instead of expensive charcoal led it to become cheaper to produce iron. So coke is charcoal with like the impurities removed out of it, and it burns better and it burns more efficiently, and that makes it easier for me to produce iron. Because again, for iron, I want to heat up the iron ore to high temperatures. I want all the impurities to rise to the top, and I want to remove those to make good quality iron. So what happens when Britain has coke that they start using as a fuel to burn and to have these refineries? Well, Britain's iron production skyrockets. It says on the handout that they started off making about 17,000 tons. Right down, it goes up to 3 million tons. It goes up to 3 million tons by 1844. So we go from 17,000 tons to 3 million tons by 1844. I mean, that is an incredible change. That is an incredible change. So guess what's going to happen to the cost of iron? Guess what's going to happen to the cost of construction? Guess what's going to happen to the ability to make tall buildings or train tracks? All these different things is going to get cheaper. Britain, it says on your handout, had massive deposits of coal and iron. The two things that they needed to fuel an industrial revolution are things that Great Britain had. They had massive deposits of coal and iron, the two things that they needed to fuel an industrial revolution. The British have coal and iron. Finally, let's talk about the steam engine, and then we'll wrap up our time together today. So the steam engine, there's a guy you should know by name. His last name is Watt, and he invents the steam engine, the role of Watt's steam engine. It replaced human, wind, and water power. It was much, just think about like the train, which we'll talk a little bit about next time. It's going to be faster than humans. more reliable than wind. Wind can only, your wind power is only as good as long as it's blowing wind. Water power is great. You have water wheels, but that's, what if that's not consistent either? But I can always burn coal. And finally, it says that improvements in water-based transportation, steamships quickly link the world in trade. And that's one of the things that we'll see. We'll see that as technology improves, the world is being connected more and more. And we'll see other ways it gets connected, like with train tracks, with telegraphs, with ship power. We're seeing at this time period in the Industrial Revolution changes that we've never seen before. We're seeing that this is a time where Great Britain takes the lead. We're seeing that this is partly because Britain has natural things that are to its advantage, natural ports, natural resources, a legal tradition protecting private property, encouraging people to take risks in ways that they would not have before. We're going to see that because of agricultural improvements, less people need to farm. More people are surviving. People are going to be able to move to the cities looking for jobs. And in these cities, they're going to be working in places, making things that they would have never made before. Things like cotton at prices that are much cheaper than ever before. Iron at prices ever cheaper than before. We're going to see division of labor. We're going to see that things that were once luxury products, things that were once super expensive, are going to become cheap. And as a result, we're going to see a world that looks very different, a world where I don't own just one cotton shirt because it's too expensive, but I own dozens of them. I don't own just a few cups, but I can own a ton of them. The world is going to look a lot different than it ever did before. It went from a world of I'm a farmer making my own clothes, growing my own food with limited possessions, to being a person that lives in a city, that works in a factory, that may have very few skills and relatively low wages, but access to things I never could have before. That's the Industrial Revolution. That's the revolution we'll continue to talk about the next time we meet. Look forward to that time. See you then. Bye.